All right, everyone, I got the thumbs up to go ahead and get started, so I am going to start us. I'm Erin Brightwell. I am faculty in Asian Languages and Cultures, and I am up here to kind of be your MC for today. So, as usual, we start out the program with a few announcements. So here we go. At 2 p.m. next Monday, so April 3rd, there will be a journalists' roundtable titled Social Impact of Mass Trauma, Processing Tragic Events in Japan and Korea. And this is going to take place in 2435 in North Quad. CJS is co-sponsoring this event, so we hope that you'll be able to take advantage of it. We also ask that you please join us 1 week from now on Thursday, April 6th, for the next lecture in the Winter 2023 CJS Thursday Lecture Series. That talk will be Yaoi/BL novels as feminism in contemporary Japan, and this will be given by Professor Kazuko Suzuki, Associate Professor at the Department of Sociology at Texas A&M. Also, that same evening, if you need a multi-part Japan fix, there will be the 10th and final entry in the Diamonds by the Decade, which is the best of CJS 75th Anniversary film series. That's going to be a screening of the 2021 film Drive My Car, which was directed by Ryusuke Hamaguchi, and it will be shown at the State Theater at 7:15. More information and tickets are available from the Michigan Theater website. For those attendees joining us via the webinar, your webcams and microphones have been muted, but we invite you to please make use of the Q&A function during the lecture to submit questions at any time, any questions that you may have, and then the presenters will try to, or presenter singular, will try to address as many as possible. The live transcription, closed caption, will be enabled, but if you would rather not have it, just go to the bottom right corner and disable it. And last but not least, please do check out our CJS events page /U of M or various social media for CJS lectures scheduled in winter 2023. Now, onto the meat of the announcements. So today, it is my great pleasure to welcome our speaker, Dr. Elizabeth Oyler, who is both Associate Professor of Japanese and Department Chair at the University of Pittsburgh. Dr. Oyler is someone whose work I first encountered as a graduate student when her, well, then new monograph appeared. Here it is, Swords, Oaths, and Prophetic Visions, Authoring Warrior Rule in Medieval Japan. And this came out from University of Hawaii Press in 2006. And this was really one of the first works, certainly in English, to push back against the sort of literature history binary. And so that was really exciting to encounter as a student. And it did so raising really provocative questions and ways to think about literary tropes. Since then, Dr. Oyler has done much, much more. I'm not going to list it all here. She sent me an 18-page CV, so let me just give you a couple of highlights. Most recently, for instance, she has received several institutional grants, including a recent 2019 Toshiba International Foundation grant for hosting the world premiere of the English language no play Gettysburg. And her co-edited volume, Cultural Imprints, War and Memory in Japan's Samurai Age, came out just last year. I will also very briefly call attention to her nearly out article, A Buddhist Perspective on War, Exile, and Women, The Tale of the Heike. I know I have a bunch of students who will be excited to read about that. And then she is currently working on a monograph titled The Apparitional Capital in No Plays of the Genpei War, which today's talk draws from, I think. So I am going to stop standing between you and the opportunity to hear a wonderful speaker. But before I do so, please join me in giving Dr. Oyler a warm welcome. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Brightwell, for that very kind introduction, and too generous, too generous. Okay, I think we're good to go. I'm really delighted to be here at the University of Michigan Center for Japanese Studies. I'd like to thank Professor Brightwell for that very kind introduction and the center for hosting me here. It's a real honor to be here. So today I'm going to be talking about movement and stasis, both actual and imagined, in the no play Ohara gokō. And this is a presentation as part of a larger project about the apparitional landscape of the capital city. And no plays derived from the war tale Heike monogatari, or Tale of the Heike, which is what my earlier book was about. For those who are unfamiliar with the work, Heike Monogatari is an account of the Genpei War of 1180 to 1185. And this is the kind of moment that's credited with ushering in Japan's warrior age. It's a long narrative account of the war that both celebrates heroes and laments losses. In its most famous form, it serves a placatory function and is recited by a solo male performer dressed in religious garb, known as a biwa hoshi, who accompanies himself on the biwa, kind of lute. And here are two anachronistic images of a biwa hoshi, one from 1501 and one much more recent. And I'm happy to talk about him later if anybody's interested. All of these kind of qualities of the text in the early 20th century led people to call Heike Monogatari Japan's epic, which is somewhat problematic, but maybe helpful for those of you who are unfamiliar with the work so far. Most no plays that are based on Heike Monogatari lament the tragic fates of heroes from the war who appear on stage in ghostly form, and then they haunt the place where they died. So men killed on the battlefield are good subjects for the no, a theater famous for its portrayal of unhappy ghosts, and an art that is inherently apparitional. In many of the best-known plays, actors portray spirits of the dead. I mean, we might think of this as kind of an embodied apparitionality. This is Atsumori from a play about a Genpei hero. The iconic form of no, favored by its most famous founder, Zeami, involves an encounter between a wandering priest and a ghost caught at the location where he or she suffered or died. The landscape to which the ghost returns is truly apparitional. Whoops. Oh, it's just gone off there, sorry. The no is performed on a mostly bare stage using minimal props. And here's an image of a stage. And the setting is almost entirely conjured by the script that is intoned by the characters and or a chorus that accompanies. Consumed by memory and longing, the ghost reenacts its attachment to the place as the priest prays for its release from suffering. The landscapes of no are thus wholly imagined, manifest on the stage only through the power of lyrical articulation of memory and nostalgic desire. And of course, these impulses are also, have a destination that is ungraspable. So the apparitional is inherent in no on a number of registers. Now, plays about warrior heroes of the Genpei War, many by Zeami or his immediate circle, cleave to this model. Such plays centered on a ghost are referred to as mugen, or dream no. They enact the suffering of a ghost. In the case of Heike heroes, a warrior killed in battle. Here's another one of my favorites, who haunts the place of his death, consumed by rage and regret. He appears to a traveling priest, first disguised as a local resident, but later revealed as the warrior's ghost, as we see him here, condemned to fight eternally in the realm of the Asheras, the Buddhist realm in which those who die on the battle are reborn only to fight eternally. The priest then prays for the ghost's release from his anger and movement toward enlightenment. So in addition to the battlefield where the death occurred, the audience is also asked to imagine the realm of the Asheras where the dead warriors engage eternally in battle. So the ghost is trapped in two places simultaneously, neither of which is actually represented visually on the stage. And I'll return to that in a little bit. Now, Ohara gokō differs from this form in that it is a genzai play in which the shite, or main character, is a living person. In this case, the former Empress Kenrei Monin. Kenrei Monin, here imagined from the 20th century, was the daughter of the Taira hegemon Kiyomori, whose unchecked ambition started the Genpei War that led to the eventual defeat of his clan at the Battle of Dan-no-ura. Importantly, in this battle, Kenrei Monin's son, the emperor, whom we call Antoku, was taken to the bottom of the sea with his grandmother as they kind of jumped overboard as it became clear that the battle was not going their way. And we'll come back to that in just a little bit. Now, in this battle, Kenrei Monin was captured by her enemies. She was returned to the capital. She took Buddhist orders, and then she retreated to Jakkoin, which you can still visit today, a Buddhist hermitage in the Ohara Hills northeast of Kyoto. And there she prayed for the souls of her war dead, including her son, the child emperor Antoku. The play stages the famous final scene from Heike Monogatari, where the retired Emperor Go-Shirakawa, who was father to the emperor to whom Kenrei Monin was served as empress, visits her at her Buddhist retreat a year after the war's conclusion, because he's heard that she has achieved Buddhist enlightenment while she's still alive, which is a miraculous occurrence. And here is a folding screen painting of the retired emperor in the middle, leaving for his procession out to Ohara, which is up in the right-hand corner there. Okay, what I find particularly interesting about this play is the way it juxtaposes the real space of Jakkoin, the retreat, and the capital city with imagined ones as it traces the stories and the travels of Kenrei Monin and Go-Shirakawa. Now, Ohara gokō is based on the Kanjō no maki, or the initiate scroll, which is a secret text appended to the 12 chapters of the Kaku Ichibon variant of the Heike Monogatari. There are lots of variants. This is the one that we know best in the West because it's the one that's been translated. All variants of Heike Monogatari conclude with the defeat of the Taira clan in the Battle of Dan no Ura. And this is at the western edge of the realm. Following this, the tale recounts that 2 of the 3 imperial regalia were returned to the capital. The losing side was punished, and warrior governance was settled. And this is when the first shogunate comes to power in Japan. So most variants of the tale also include some version of Kenrei Monin's fate, often as an episode or a short narrative passage within the main body of the tale. But in the Kaku Ichibon and some other variants, her story is displaced to this discrete Kanjō no maki, which is then appended to the end of the tale. So in this form, as a separate secret piece, it provides something like a commentary that subtly reframes the tale by shifting the narrative focus to Kenrei Monin, who, having taken the tonsure, is able to conceptualize her life and her clan's fate as something like a Buddhist parable, one ending with her miraculous enlightenment in this life. And this is also puts her in a solid position from which she can assure the proper spiritual care of the potentially malevolent souls of her kin who died badly and are not in the same state she is. So the heart of Kanjō no maki is Kenrei Monin's narration of her life as a journey through the Rokudo, or 6 realms of Buddhist existence, which are visualized here. Sometimes they're represented in the form of a wheel of life, as they are here. This is the rinne. Where am I? And in this representation, they're kind of simultaneously existing worlds in which beings are reborn after death, each according to their fate. It's a map of karmic suffering for the not yet enlightened. And we have the Deva realm at the top, which is kind of heavenly, the realm of the humans, the realm of the Asheras, which we've already encountered, and I think they're actually flipped in between these two. The realm of the hungry ghosts, the realm of beasts, and then the hell realm. And often that hell realm is further articulated. Kenrei Monin's recognition of her life as a journey through all of these indicates that she's no longer in them. And she's achieved enlightenment, which is a point of quietude outside the constant churn of existence. So it's a good end. It's a good way to be. And this is unlike, of course, those of her kin who died on the battlefield. So by narrating her travels through and then beyond these realms, Kanjō no maki brings Buddhist order to the end of the tale, which balances a restoration of royal order. We have a new emperor with the imperial regalia back in the capital, and Kenrei Monin as a representative of the defeated Heike, or her clanspeople, tonsured and living at Jakkoin, having apprehended an important Buddhist truth. So it's a restoration of structure and stasis after a period of chaos and turbulence. However, Kenrei Monin must engage in constant prayers for her dead so that they will also achieve enlightenment, thereby assuring that they will not return as malevolent spirits to wreak havoc in the here and now, which was always a concern of people who died bad deaths. So it's a kind of narrative restructuring that both asserts closure and acknowledges closure's always contingent state. And this is the story that Ohara gokō also stages. Now, the meeting between Kenrei Monin and Go Shirakawa that is recounted in the play is mentioned in historical records. It occurred in 1186, 1 year after the end of the war, when Go Shirakawa was 58 years old and Kenrei Monin was about 30. Kenrei Monin's relationship to Go Shirakawa stretched back to her childhood. Here's a kind of map of relationships. She was the daughter of the Taira hegemon Kiyomori, and then called Tokuko, her given name. And she was adopted by Go Shirakawa in 1171 in preparation to put her into service to his son, Emperor Takakura. She was further elevated to Chugu, empress, in 1172 to cement this political alliance between Go Shirakawa and her father. At that time, she was 16, Takakura was 11. Their union made way for Kiyomori's precipitous political rise under Go Shirakawa's patronage, which was kind of what started us down the road to the Genpei War. Actually, what really started us down the road was a child was born to Takakura and Tokuko in 1178. Takakura was forced to abdicate in 1180 in favor of the child, and then we kind of marched forward very quickly to the Genpei War. Now, Takakura died in 1181, and at this point, Go Shirakawa sought to take Tokuko into his own service, and this was an overture that was supported by her parents, but apparently decisively rebuffed by Tokuko herself in what appears to be a kind of remarkable and perhaps unique assertion of personal agency. The Gyokuyo, the diary of Kujo Kanezane mentions this unsuccessful bid by Go Shirakawa to make her his, but the Heike variants allied it, which happens a lot in the Heike. At the end of 1181, Tokuko was given the name, the rank of Kenrei Monin in recognition of her status as the reigning emperor's mother. And I mention this history to underline that Go Shirakawa's interests in Kenrei Monin were not purely kind of political or religious. Kenrei Monin fled the capital with the rest of her clan, the Taira, in 1183, only returning as a prisoner once the war ended in 1185. She then took the tonsure, retreated to Ohara, and began to pray for her dead. She has 2 attendants at her retreat who were also bereft survivors of the war, Dainagon no Tsubone, who was the primary wife of Kenrei Monin's brother, Shigehira, and also served as nursemaid to Kenrei Monin's son, the Emperor Antoku. The second was Awa no Naishi, who was the daughter or the granddaughter of Fujiwara no Shinzei, an early Taira ally. Now, the No Ohara gokō is part of the active repertoire of all 5 major No schools, and there are small variations in staging, particularly with the Hosho school. Its author is unknown, although scholarship makes a strong case for Komparu Zenchiku. It's categorized as a 2-act genzai play of the 3rd category, which means that the main character, the shitei, is a beautiful aristocratic woman. Its cast consists of 8 characters, which is large but not unusual in a genzai no. The identity of the 2 central characters, a former empress and a retired emperor, necessitate a dignity and restraint appropriate to their status. So consequently, there's no final dance in the play, which is more usual. And as Sanari Kentaro and those who follow him note, this is a quiet play, one that is intended more to be heard than seen. The script follows more strongly than any other Zeami's advice to integrate the actual text of the Heike monogatari when writing about the great figures of the Genpei War. And both the stateliness of the characters and the reliance on a narrative that is essentially about articulating closure to a horrific story makes this a play that, although relatively static in its climax, is framed both narratively and kinetically by specific kinds of motion that undercut this placidity. So, on to the play. The play opens with the placement of the of a set piece, the owaraya or waraya, this hut here, this figure representing a hut. And this represents Kenrei Monin's retreat. And so that's placed on the stage. And that, by placing it on the stage, we situate the space as Ohara, the residence of Kenrei Monin. And this opening actually resembles several other plays about beautiful women who are suffering after being cast out of society, Yokihi and Sekidera Komachi in particular. All of these plays bring the shite, the main character, to the stage in a covered set piece, then reveal her, and ultimately leave her in place at the end of the play. Paul Atkins notes that other qualities that Ohara gokō shares with particularly Yokihi, which is about young Gui Fei, include that the woman has imperial status, she's been cast out, and she now inhabits a special space that's marked by a special status. And he uses that as an argument to credit the play to Zenchiku, which is part of his larger project. What I'd like to draw attention to is the placement of the owaraya immediately as a visual suggestion that will have thematic resonances with these other plays, and I'll be talking about that as we move forward. What's unusual structurally in Ohara gokō is that the scene then immediately shifts to the capital with the arrival on stage of two of Go Shirakawa's men discussing the retired sovereign's plans to visit Ohara. The waki, who is a courtier, announces that the war has ended, and the waki is this kind of secondary character, and that the 3 imperial regalia have been returned safely to the capital. It's an assertion of order restored, marked by the return to the capital of the markers of sovereignty, even though in fact only 2 of them made it back. The courtier notes that Kenrei Monin has taken the tonsure and retreated to Jakkoin, and that the cloistered retired former emperor Go Shirakawa has decided to pay her a visit. Thus the opening finds us in 2 places at once. We're at the cloister at Jakkoin, represented by the owaraya, and the capital where the announcement is made. And although this doubling of space is not unique in Ohara gokō, it's interesting that these 2 endpoints in her life, the capital where she spent most of her youth, and Jakkoin where she's going to spend her last days, are collapsed into each other at the opening of the play. It invites a pairing of royal space, of the palace, and the Buddha space at Jakkoin that remains active throughout the play and imbues Jakkoin, the space reified on stage by the owaraya, a kind of fixity that mirrors that of the capital city to which the imperial regalia have been safely restored, even though that space is always only imagined in the play. Now at this point, the courtiers leave the stage, returning the setting to Ohara. They've thus entered and left the stage without actually traveling anywhere. Now the owaraya is uncovered, revealing Kenrei Monin and her attendants dressed, and we have them at the bottom here, unmistakably as nuns and masked with masks representing aristocratic women of varying ages. Kenrei Monin then opens her first lines, quote an anonymous poem from the Kokinshu that also that is used to evoke her move to Ohara in the Heike as well. So we're always getting kind of references through the Heike to earlier works. Okay, and that poem is, "A mountain village is loneliness itself, but rather a brushwood hut than the torments of the world." Now, this is an oft-quoted poem in the classical Japanese traditions. It's used, for example, in Genji Monogatari to describe Uji, and in other words, it's kind of situating her residence here within a conventionally poeticized, kind of generic, rustic landscape, but one that is often associated with a woman outside the capital. She then continues. A door of plaited branches, a gaping fence, the posts far apart as news from the capital, bamboo pillars thickly knotted as the grief that has come our way. And then she's joined by her 2 attendants, who then continue to describe the scene in conventional poetic vocabulary which heightens this conventionally rustic atmosphere. They live far from others' eyes. The only sounds they hear are the crack of the woodsman's axe, the sighing of the wind through the branches, and the crying of monkeys' voices. So these images mark the place as humble and cut off from the capital. And this atmosphere of simplicity and rusticity permeates the play, evoking the humble dwellings of other beautiful women, either cast out or abandoned, who can do nothing but await rediscovery. And among these, we find prominently in No Kogo, Ono no Komachi, and Yugao. And these are often termed as hitomatsu onna, or women who wait for someone. And this is an objectified, sexualized identity. So the characterization of Kenrei Monin here as a hitomatsu onna is important for the play. And it remains in tension with her identity as a renunciant, an identity apparent in her costume, and almost immediately in the script, which goes on to quote a couplet from the Wakan Roeshu by Tachibana Naomoto, in which Kenrei Monin compares herself to two virtuous disciples of Confucius. And I've kind of marked in orange the shodan, the kind of segments of the No play, and in blue, the people who are doing the reciting. And as in Yan Yuan's Lane, the grass grows rampant sorrows, of which this is the destination. The rain that drenches Yuan Shan's door, and the tears soaking our sleeves, the tears soaking our sleeves. So like these wise men, she has intentionally chosen to live humbly and outside society. So from the outset, Jakoin is both a retreat of a virtuous Buddhist practitioner and this poeticized, out-of-the-way dwelling of an abandoned beauty. Now, against this backdrop, Kenrei Monin announces that she'll go to the hills to pick shikimi, or star anise, which will be for her to put on her Buddhist altar. Dainagon no Tsubone proposes to join her and gather firewood and warabi, or shoots, for the kitchen. Kenrei Monin then compares their foraging to that of the historical Buddha. And she says, Prince Siddhartha too left the capital of King Shuddhodama and scaled the steep slopes of Mount Dantaloka to pick herbs, draw water, and gather firewood. Practicing great austerities, he served the holy hermits, and at last he reached complete illumination. I too would serve the Buddha. Now, this is the first of several important descriptions of movement in the play, and two kinds of motion are activated. First, Kenrei Monin leaves to gather shikimi in the mountains, an act of humility similar to that of the historical Buddha. The comparison also hints that her departure from the capital and her imperial status is like that of the historical Buddha. The destination of both intentional exiles, she notes, is to reach complete illumination. It's a kind of movement evoking the linear abandonment of royal space for religious space, and the two realms are separated by this journey away from the royal center. But hers is also the motion of great austerities, this repetitive and circular movement through daily practice of gathering provisions for her Buddhist altar. In other words, we see the doubling of a circular journey over a linear one, and that's a motif that we see throughout the play. Now, the two women then leave the stage, heading deep to the mountains, effectively creating an echo of the Buddha's sacred practices in their less exotic hills in Ohara. And the first act ends at this point with Awa no Naishi, the second attendant, beside the Owaraya, and the others having departed on the Hashigakari, or the bridgeway. Now, the second act opens with Go Shirakawa's travel to Ohara. He and his party enter the Hashigakari, a prop representing a palanquin held over the retired emperor by men in his service. Notice that his costume, too, marks him as a renunciant. So this is an imperial progress. It's a trip away from the capital by a royal figure with an entourage, but it's also a slipping away to outside that space. And in Heike monogatari, it's referred to as a shinobi no gokō, kind of a secret visit, hinting that Go Shirakawa has perhaps prurient, I'm afraid to use that word anymore, inclinations. The travel sequence itself is short. We have, Goshira says, chasing after the traces of blooms fallen in the cloud-encircled capital, following the new leaves, we travel the mountain path. Parting the dew-covered deep grasses, parting the dew-covered deep grasses, we hurry the procession along to Ohara. Okay, this season, therefore, we're set in a season. Seasons are always important to know. Here we are at the cusp of summer. And when the I've gotten behind myself. I'm sorry. This scene, as they arrive, prompts Go Shirakawa to compose a poem. On the surface, whoops, I'm sorry. I've missed something. I'm sorry. We gotta take the Ohara. Okay, so the season is the cusp of summer. And when the retired emperor casts his gaze on Jakoin, we find the dew-laden garden, thick with summer grasses, the greening strands of the willow interlacing. The waves of grasses floating on the pond are like a glittering brocade, the yamabuki blooms haphazard on the shore, and a lone cuckoo calls through the breaks in the eightfold clouds as if awaiting the visit of His Majesty. So the landscape is responding to the retired emperor's arrival with this felicitous vista, punctuated by the call of a lone cuckoo, which happens other places in the Heike to mark felicitation. The scene then prompts Go Shirakawa to compose a poem. And it is, on the surface of the pond, the petals of the cherry from the bank lie scattered, a pond full of petal waves. Now, scholars note the subtle erotic overtones shooting through this section. The season of delicate beauty, that of the cherry blossom, which is so soon to arrive, I think, in Michigan, has given way to the fecundity and the rot of the first hint of summer. Go Shirakawa's specific gaze falls to the fallen petals on the surface of the pond. It is their scattered fallenness that attracts him, and it's easy to find a parallel here to the former empress, now past the fresh beauty of youth and fallen on so many levels. The men's arrival thus exhibits a kind of voyeuristic anticipation of seeing just how far she has fallen. And as they arrive, they find what they expect, a lush and slightly wild landscape, patiently waiting Go Shirakawa's gaze, in which the plants, the clouds, and the birds kind of express their gratitude. But almost immediately, the party is met with a reality that contradicts this vision. Go Shirakawa fails to recognize Awa no Naishi, a gentlewoman he should have recognized, now that she's become a nun. Also, his timing is off, and he must wait now for Kenrei Monin's return. And this is a subtle but meaningful reversal. He's entered a space where, contrary to his party's earlier assertion, his arrival does not quite mark a moment of perfect natural harmonization through the royal gaze, but rather one of misrecognition and mistiming. His arrival and his gaze do not apprehend the, of course still invisible, landscape fully. So Kenrei Monin and Dainagon no Tsubone now reappear along the Hashigakari, not yet aware of Go Shirakawa's presence. Kenrei Monin is deep in memories about her lost son, mother, and family members, and she prays for them. Again, her circuit of the hills behind the hermitage to collect offerings is punctuated by her calls to Amida Buddha to lead her dead to perfect awakening, again suggesting her movement as a form of religious practice and kind of circular. Awa no Naishi and Go Shirakawa see the women returning in the distance, and Go Shirakawa asks which is which. In their current garb as nuns, he can't recognize the woman he's looking for. So hearing voices at the hermitage, the two women pause at the second and third pines along the Hashigakari, and Awa no Naishi leaves the stage to go and meet them. Informed by Awa no Naishi of Go Shirakawa's arrival, Kenrei Monin replies, "Oh, how hard it is to forget the delusive attachments of the world. Should my sullied name leak out once more, the sight of leaking tears and the appearance of these sleeves will be shameful. Yet he follows the law, the same path as myself. To talk to him will bring comfort. Before the window I called Amida's name in single-minded expectation of the light of his coming, awaiting the welcoming throng of his holy company, but I never anticipated this visit at dusk. Has the past returned to renew my tears. So she's wavering here quite a bit. Interestingly, she's also coming to him from the stage while he's on the stage. So we've kind of had this reversal of, who's coming to visit whom. Now, scholars remark on Kenrei Monin's concern about her sullied name, this Ukina, which I have highlighted in yellow. She's obviously ashamed to be the only survivor among her kin, but Ukina generally connotes something sexual as the cause for the sullied name, and her response suggests that it is her sexual reputation when it comes to Go Shirakawa that remains a concern even here in her enlightened state. Her devotions have brought her not the welcoming throng of heavenly deities to carry her forward, but rather an unwanted visit at dusk with all its erotic implication. It's also a return to the past, a cause to renew her tears. Whereas she'd hoped she was awaiting a future of enlightenment through Amida, instead she finds herself as this waiting woman, a characterization that activates the heartbreaking memories, drawing her instead into her past, suggesting the backward kind of temporal motion that we often find more in a mugen no, and I'll return to that in just a minute. Now, progressing to the first pine, Kenrei Monin now imagines the journey that Go Shirakawa has just made, and sometimes she echoes and sometimes she reframes that story. So she says, now, what season is it when he makes the imperial progress? Spring has passed, now it is summer, the time of the northern festival, the greening leaves in summer groves, lamenting this reminder of spring, the white clouds caught on the distant mountains, are they a memento of the fallen blossoms? Pushing his way through the fields of summer grasses to where the path peters out. Here, in the quiet, in the radiance of quiet radiance, Jakoin is the kind of retreat of quiet radiance. Sunlight sparkles on the pine branches, summer's waves of wisteria over the pond. They have all awaited his arrival. So she echoes the earlier evocation of white clouds, the pond, the rankness of growth, the fallen petals, all in anticipation of Go Shirakawa's arrival, and I've highlighted those kind of overlaps in this slide. The entangled willows and yamabuki from the former are replaced here with the perhaps more auspicious wisteria and pine, which arguably creates a more kind of static image, but her description generally follows his. This is a rustic, isolated, slightly wild place that welcomes the beneficent gaze of the former sovereign. However, at this point, she introduces an alternative object for that gaze. Hidden in new leaves, late flowering cherries, okure zakura, have a loveliness rarer than the year's first blossoms. Perhaps this unusual sight may move his majesty. So Kenrei Monin thus is, instead of being, she's not allowing herself to be seen as scattered blossoms, but instead asserting that she's the late blossom that appears on a tree that's already gone to leaf. This describes a different kind of blooming, a flowering that only appears after the fragility of early spring has passed, a beauty released in the maturity of the season, perhaps a metaphor for spiritual as well as physical beauty. And as she delivers these lines, she enters the stage, retracing but also redirecting Go Shirakawa's progress. Shirasu Masako notes that this is the moment on which the play turns in performance. Kenrei Monin enters the stage, she faces Go Shirakawa, allowing him to finally see her fully. Shirasu remarks, quote, here a particular ethereal quality wafts through the nun alone, and it doesn't meet the retired emperor's expectations. And what Shirasu is calling Kenrei Monin's ethereality, I think, is tied to her ability to reimagine herself as something other than fallen, something rare and beautiful because it's unexpected, because it blooms after the more common varieties of sakura have scattered. Her beauty, in other words, lies in her blossoming after the tree has gone to leaf, after her life as empress, after the war, and after her losses. So in reframing the destination that might delight Go Shirakawa, Kenrei Monin restores Jakoin to this important meaning of being physically a haven away from the capital, a place of religious refuge, but also standing temporally as somehow after, separated from her former life. Thus, this peregrination of her Buddhist practice into the hills and back becomes a template for her to subtly reshape the retired sovereign's journey, finding in it the more profound quest for knowledge, embedded in a more general curiosity about her fate. And this brings it into line with what is appropriate to someone who travels the same Buddhist path, that state that is associated with removal from the usual worldly delight, like the first blossoms of the cherry. And of course, it is she who's doing the arriving here, while he is doing the waiting. So, but this tension between the conceptualization of Kenrei Monin is nevertheless not resolved. When she greets Go Shirakawa, it is with a poem that keeps alive the notion of her fallen status by emphasizing her removal from the palace, the space emblematic of her former life. Never did I think then that I should live one day among the distant hills and behold the palace moon from afar. Then the poem is found at the same juncture in Kanjō no Maki, and it hints strongly at this nostalgia for precisely the life and the place from which she, as an enlightened being, has been removed. And so, on the one hand, she's this detached, enlightened being having traversed the 6 realms and being away from everything, but she's still this heartbroken survivor who's been removed from her home base of the palace. So Kenrei Monin's description of her life as a journey through the Rokudo, which comes next, is the highlight of Kanjō no Maki and of Ohara gokō. Now, in the No, it appears in a much abbreviated lyrical version compared to the Kanjō no Maki. As in the source text, her story from the vantage point of Jakoin takes a linear journey, her family's flight from the capital and to their demise at Danoura on the westernmost edge of the realm, and through recasting it as a Buddhist pilgrimage, a kind of circular motion through a different sort of landscape, turns it into a meditation that brings enlightenment. And this is long, and I apologize. I've highlighted all of the 6 realms in yellow here. And I'm going to start through these. Yes, I knew the pleasures of paradise. That would be the Deva realm. But they proved short-lived. Like crystals of dew on trailing vines, not destined to long endure. Before many years passed, the 5 wasting ailments set in, yet I could not melt away when my decline had come, but wandered in delusion at the crossroads of the 6 realms. First, my whole clan was tossed on the waves of the western sea, living all the time on ships with never a safe harbor. We gazed at the sea, but it was salt and useless to quench our thirst. I knew the realm of the hungry ghosts, number 2. Sometimes, too, we were gripped with fear as high inshore swells threatened to capsize us against the rocky coast. Then from the massed ships rose shrieks and lamentation. I wondered in horror if this was how sinners howl in the hell of piercing cries. That's one of the hell realms, the 3rd. When we fought on land, I saw with my own eyes the realm of Asherahs, number 4, and its terrifying wars. Then I heard the pounding hooves of numberless galloping horses, a sight and sound no different from the realm of beasts, 5. Yes, I suffered all of these torments in the realm of humans. What deeper sadness than this end to a life that has turned all pain? So these 6 realms are generally conceptualized as distinct, simultaneous, ever-present, and therefore static, right? Places, the way, on that wheel of life, this kind of endless cycle. And so travel through them is at once like actual travel through space and like being caught in this endless loop of repetition. The ultimate goal is to escape through full apprehension of the true nature of existence. And Kenrei Monin's description of her journey through them all in one lifetime is miraculous because it only takes one lifetime, and it happens while she is still alive. So she's someone who has reached enlightenment in this life, which is kind of a conundrum and a miracle. This mystery is thematically what marks Kanjō no Maki in the Heike tradition as special and as secret. And like that text, here it is performed as a lyrical narrative. The shite kneels and tells the story of her life. the description of movement, and kind of great movement, is held in the stillness of the kneeling actor. At this point, Go Shirakawa urges her to recount the last moments of the life of her child, which is kind of a horrible thing to think about. When Lady Ni, Kenrei-Monin's mother, jumped from her boat into the sea clutching Antoku, and that sword, the third of the imperial regalia. Now, in the tale of the Heike, Antoku's death is kind of morphed into, it's part of Kenrei-Monin's Six Realms story. But here it comes after a break, after Go Shirakawa specifically asks for it. And I'm going to just go through the very end of it. We start with the shite, Kenrei-Monin, telling us what happened. And she starts by quoting her son. "Where are we going?" he asked. His grandmother replies, "This country is full of traitors, a vile and odious place. But the realm of supreme bliss, a wonderful place, lies beneath the waves. We will go there together." He said, "I understand." Turning to the east, he bade farewell to the Shining One, Amaterasu, the great goddess. Then he faced west to call 10 times the name of Amida Buddha, and then he recites a poem. "Now at last I know, in the Minosuso River, deep beneath the waves, there lies another capital." This was his last poem. Okay, in Heike Monogatari, Antoku's destination is the realm of the Dragon King at the bottom of the sea. And in the Heike, that's how we figure the realm of beasts into this journey through the six realms. In other words, that's what represents the realm of beasts. However, in the play, by contrast, it's a place outside of the six realms. We've already gone through the realm of the beasts. And this is something structurally like an escape from the six realms that's similar to Kenrei-Monin's. The residence of the emperor, the child emperor, and presumably the third of the imperial regalia, stands as an alternative and kind of 3 times apparitional capital city, one conceived in the play as a political removal from the six realms, just as Kenrei-Monin's hermitage is a religious removal from the six realms. And this isn't a topic I'm going to explore more today, but it's relevant for my thinking through the meaning of this apparitional capital city, and I'd be happy to get some input on that later. Okay, so telling this story reduces Kenrei-Monin to tears, and her final words to Go Shirakawa suggest that her enlightenment isn't complete. She says, "Now that I have seen your face once more, my sleeves are damp with unwitting tears. How ashamed I am. Could these lingering memories ever be exhausted?" Go Shirakawa's men now urge him to head for home, and he does, leaving behind Kenrei-Monin, weeping by her hut. So by way of conclusion, I'd like to tentatively map these spaces on the kind of the other vital dimension that we're talking about, which is time. As I've portrayed it here, Jakoin in Ohara gokō is at once a place in time, a location where the actual Go Shirakawa visited the actual Kenrei-Monin, and this is the set for this Genzai no, and a place that is out of time, or maybe after time. I've noted earlier the stasis inherent in the shite, the main character, enacted on the stage through her relative stillness and her casting of her movement as circular, returning to where she started. In Buddhist terms, this kind of movement suggests the practice of austerities and also of pilgrimage, specific kinds of motion encased in the stasis of a retreat and enlightenment. It's a quiet state, and its repetitions are a buttress against the teleological trajectory of kind of quotidian time. This is true of her peregrinations into the hills to gather shikimi, and it's also true of her travel through the six realms. So her stasis is embodied in a lack of movement in the second act. She narrates her travels through the six realms and the death of her son as she kneels. Her fixity contrasts with Go Shirakawa's movements. He leaves the capital to seek her out, in part to view her fallen state, in part to understand her enlightened status. So it's an excursion and it's an imperial progress. But ultimately, it too is a circular journey, a pilgrimage from which he returns to the capital, having heard Kenrei Monin's story of the six realms, and he comes back with a new kind of understanding of her and maybe of other things. But in no terms, return of this sort also connotes an inability to escape the past, which is in line with the assertion that Shirasu makes, that in form, this play resembles a mugen no. It looks a lot like a play where we start out with a ghost in disguise and then the ghost is revealed in the second act. And this opens the possibility of considering what's being staged not only as the enlightened Kenrei Monin's narration of her removal from time in this life, but perhaps its inverse as well. Her unenlightened enactment of her past in this afterlife. In the play, Kenrei Monin concludes her narrative of Antoku's death with a description of her attempted suicide. After her mother jumped from the boat with her son, she followed, but she says, I followed them and sank into the sea, but a warrior pulled me out, adding unwelcome days to this worthless life. So in certain respects, in the No, she is depicted as someone who has already died and who is no longer of this world, someone with ample reason for regret and for attachment. So in this respect, the sense of being after, associated with the late blossoming cherry, is evocative of this kind of afterlife. And this is an appropriate place for an enlightened being, but also for an unenlightened ghost. So we're faced with this interesting suggestion that Jakoin is at once a holy place inhabited by the former empress, whose religious practice assures conclusion to the war, but it's at the same time the residence of this heartbroken, clinging spirit of the mother of Antoku, who will never escape the memory of her last moments. And this is an important conundrum at the heart of the play. On the one hand, Kenrei Monin represents the cessation of suffering as one who has traversed the six realms, while on the other, she's embodying that suffering precisely because of this experience. So Ohara gokō suggests a collapsing together of this kind of static enlightenment and the stoppage of time, represented by a former empress, now a nun, ensconced in her hermitage, and this, by contrast, this relentless pull of the past that often motivates Mugen no. So what we're left with at the very end, I think is pretty ambivalent. We have this Buddhist timeless space of reclusion and enlightenment, but one that is irrevocably tied to the stasis of memory, another kind of maybe not so great stasis to be in. This is kind of this endless, inescapable time that is stuck in the past, even as the season has moved on. Thank you very much. And I said this, as I said, this is something that I'm working on and working through, and I appreciate anyone's thoughts on how I might move forward.
Yes, Yuri and I are here to man the question or person the questions, so also we'll be fielding them from the audience as they come in, so please flag one of us down if you have a question, and we do have somebody from the audience in the chat box, so I'll sit down and read this. So this is a question from Vijayanti Selinger, who says, Elizabeth, thank you for a wonderful talk. You present a wonderful case study of how the status of Kenrei Monin, or the stasis of Kenrei Monin, involves a great deal of movement across metaphysical and physical planes. I have two questions. Is it possible to think of the covered prop at the beginning of the play as indicating her captivity that she eventually gains release from? Of course, you imply that it may not be by calling it static enlightenment. And the second question then is, and how can we think of the other undersea capital that you mentioned? So.
Okay, I'll start with the first. Hi, Jayanti, I'm glad you're here. It's very strange to be in this position in a virtual, anyway. It's good to not see you, but know you're there. Yes, I think that this prop, let me see if I can, that prop, the prop that's, the waraya, like many other props that look like it in the No, it represents captivity, or can represent captivity. And the other play that I think you've, Jayanti, have heard me talk about is Yuya, which also has her, she's trapped in a carriage. But this idea of entrapment, I think, is there, and I think resonates across any play that uses this kind of prop. And so, yes, maybe she, maybe this is, I'm going to quote Paul Atkins, I think, and say, maybe she does get out and maybe she doesn't get out. But I think that this prop, yes, stands as something that could be marking that. I think it's a really, really good kind of way to help think through this. I'm not sure where I get with that, but that is certainly something to think about. And then the Ryugu, the dragon palace under the sea, which is such an important trope when we're thinking about enlightenment and the Dragon King's daughter gaining enlightenment, and also Antoku, and you know more about this than I do, I think, but this kind of, what I find interesting in this play is the way that the Rokudo, that the realm of the beasts is kind of taken away from the Ryugu and moved into the galloping horses, that thus creates a different sort of space for the Ryugu. And one of the things I'm interested in is the way that there are all these other kind of capitals that show up in these no plays, like the ruined capital of Omi and Fukuhara and Nara, and and that kind of, there seems to be a preoccupation with that, which is something I'm trying to explore in the larger work. I hope that answers.
Other questions?
Thank you so much for such a fascinating talk. As you know, I am not a specialist in any of this, so I apologize in advance for the sheer ignorance in my questions. The first thing I was going to say was just the way you responded to Jayanthi's question. I was thinking, oh, it's so funny. We have these funny little Zoom ghosts here too,
we
right?
do.
Where like I've had that experience where I'm so grateful that someone's joining from Zoom, and I also don't know how to make eye contact with them because I can't, where's the camera, what's going on? So I just thought that was pretty fun. The first is probably a very silly technical question. Can ghosts be enlightened? I wasn't sure if that was a binary where she's either a ghost or she's enlightened and can't be both.
I think she really can't be both, except that she sort of is both here.
Okay.
I think that she is both here, and I'm not sure that everybody would agree with me on that. And maybe Erin has some thoughts on that. Okay.
Adjusting.
Okay.
My broader question is about why Go Shirakawa would ask her this question about her son's death, and it just sounds like such a mean question. And I was trying to be open-minded and think, okay, is he trying to prompt her to talk about her enlightenment? Like, could it possibly be a kind of flattering question or a provocative in a positive way? But I was just wondering what you thought about that or what you could share, and that it also, I couldn't tell if that moment is about him or is about her, if that makes sense. Like, is he trying to trap her? I go to some kind of Game of Thrones. Like, is this a power move on his part to very firmly put her in her place, which is as a grieving, presumably incompetent mom? I guess it's interesting that we don't have a word like widow to describe someone who's lost a child. Isn't that interesting? But anyway, so something like that. Mm-hmm. And denying her the possible enlightenment that she might have reached. Or is it maybe a genuine question to ask her to talk about this incredible experience and these incredible accomplishments that she's had? So anyway, I would love to hear anything you care to share.
Okay, and my gut feeling is that they need to get that story in because it's part of the Rokudo, and they haven't. There may be some kind of narrative structural exigency in play here. There probably is. However, yeah, I'm bothered by that question. It's like, why would you? But I think that probably that's not the right question to be asking. Maybe the answer is, why does he ask that question? He is giving her an opportunity to, kind of work, get to enlightenment, or he's helping her, reminding her of her enlightened state, or he's reminding her of her, her subordinate state. And I think I tend to find ambivalence in it. I'm not sure that everybody would agree with me about that. I think, but I do, but I think we're not supposed to see it as a mean question, even though it really feels like it. But I do think it is something that is, he's enabling her to do something more, and which direction he's trying to take her or which direction it eventually takes her, I think is more ambivalent. At least that's my read on it. I'm not sure I'm right about that.
I mean, I found myself wondering if it was not an attempt to get her to recognize the illusory nature of her own belief in her enlightenment.
Right.
Because, of course, the idea of an enlightened woman is also kind of shocking.
Problematic, right, so from the start, right? Everything about her state here doesn't really make sense. And, and whether this is something that is trying to kind of assert it by allowing her to repeat it, or whether it is undermining that. And I think there's always, I think that in a lot of these, there's a lot of undermining going on, even if it's kind of quiet. But yes, there's nothing about this that makes any sense. You shouldn't be enlightened in this life. You certainly shouldn't be enlightened in this life if you're a woman. And having gone through all of this, probably isn't enough to get you to enlightenment. So I think it's also kind of a, it's a vestige of this being this is an interpretation of the Heike, which uses this particular story to assert a sort of closure, while at the same time, standing as a recitational text that is about placation of these ghosts that are running around causing earthquakes and other things, So there's this, that this is a product of that world as well, and maybe as strongly so as any no play is. I don't know. Somebody, Jayanti, you may have some thoughts on that too. Okay.
Other questions?
Sorry. Thank you so much for your very interesting lecture. I had a quick question regarding the props used, because I noticed that the nun is under the waraya, but then when Shirakawa comes in during the procession, there's another, forgive my ignorance, like roof thing going on there. Yeah. So I was wondering if there was like any sort of parallel being drawn between the nun and Shirakawa with both of these props, and if the representation of these props were consistent among different performances that you have analyzed.
Okay, that's a really good question. So first thing about the prop. So this one is an o waraya. It's a big waraya. There are also small waraya, and the Hosho school uses a smaller one. So there's kind of, it does the same thing, but it's different on stage. The palanquin, or the prop that is used to represent a palanquin, from what I can tell, I have not seen this play performed in a very, very long time. Not since I started thinking about it. So yes, you can find representations of that looking a little different. The interesting thing about the prop that he comes in is that it's held by two people and it moves with him. And so I think that there is a case to be made for, a parallel between the two. I mean, there are lots of parallels between these two. They are, they're tonsured, they're former, they're royalty, they are, and they are joined in many, many ways. But there's also this difference of it being something that kind of follows him when visually on the stage, which I think you can make something of. Yeah, I think it's a really, really interesting way to look at the use of, the props are really kind of interesting, particularly because there are so few, they're symbolic, they're they're kind of very, very basically representative of something, and you use very similar props from one play to the next to represent slightly different things, which, so you're reading all of those usages of something that looks pretty similar onto a given prop. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the really interesting talk, and excited for the next project. And I was just wondering if you could talk, I'm thinking about maybe for students or other folks listening, a little bit about kind of how you consider the work that you're doing with this project in relation to some of the really great work that you've been doing with things like Gettysburg. Aaron mentioned it, you know, so in terms of thinking about place, in terms of thinking about mourning, in terms of thinking about different types of mobility, if you kind of, either ways in which working on that context of the Civil War has kind of helped you kind of conceptualize or kind of rethink things that you're maybe more familiar with and know, or vice versa?
It's a wonderful question, and one that will require, you know, if I come to an answer, it will be in the middle of the night tonight. But my worlds do tend to overlap, and this idea of, you know, memorial and memorial associated with place, and our, you know, all of our, you know, we're deeply connected to places of memory, and particularly difficult memory. Gettysburg being one of them. Recently to New York and finally saw the memorial for 9/11, which I found incredibly moving. But just this, you know, this kind of human need to memorialize, and memorialization is of course what the Heike monogatari does. In some cases, it's what the No does. Certainly, these plays that I'm looking at, and I guess something. You know, thinking about memorialization kind of in the larger sense and kind of spaces motivates me thinking about how they get represented or not represented on the stage in No, and this idea that, you know, you already are asked to imagine a lot, but then when you start imagining things on top of other things, what does that mean? And that's kind of what I'm trying to work through with this project. So I'm not very well, I'm into it and I'm thinking about it, but I don't have a definitive conclusion to it. So I'm not sure I'll ever have I don't have a conclusion that I'm willing to commit to, let me put it that way.
Thank you. We have a question from the audience, from Jia Yuan, who is a alum of our program, and she writes in and says, "Thank you so much for a very interesting talk. To follow up on what you said about how this play hasn't been performed for a while, I was wondering if there's anything we know about the popularity and how widely it was performed during the medieval period in comparison to other No plays such as Atsumori."
Okay, I'm sorry if I led you to believe that it hasn't been performed recently. That's not the case. I haven't been to Japan since I started working on this. Well, I haven't been to Japan when it was performed since I started working on this. So I don't have a good answer to that. I know it was performed. I don't know how often it was performed in comparison to something like Atsumori. It wasn't kind of dropped the way that Shigehira, or I'm sorry, that Shigehira was. But that's a very good question, and one that I will have to address as I move forward. But it appears to be, you know, it does appear in records from the 16th century and so forth. So it's not that it disappeared. The degree to which Heike related No were performed versus others is a really interesting question that I have started to look at, but I'm looking forward to having someone who's good at big data help me out with, I guess.
Other questions from the audience? We have a few more minutes. I'm wondering if you can actually just tell us a little bit more about, I can't say it, but the apparitional capital concept.
I can't say it either, and I'm my problem is I say it, sometimes capital gets, if you talk to, for example, an anthropologist or someone in another field, capital means lots of things, right? So it's the apparitional landscape of the capital city. So this started with, well, I started thinking about Tadanori, which is from my money, no, it's my favorite of Zeami's plays. And it's one that that is set at Suma, which is this location following the Battle of Ichi-no-Tani, where Tadanori was killed, which is also the site of, Genji's exile, which is also sort of the site of the, failed capital at Fukuhara, which is a really heavily laden site. And the poem that Tadanori is, the poem that Tadanori, that kind of this all, he composed a poem about the ruined capital at Omi, and it doesn't appear in the No play. But it's in the, but it's what the whole play is about. There are a lot of allusions to it in the play. And so we also have this kind of ruined capital of Omi, this other capital that comes, why is that? And so my kind of working thesis is that we have a lot of, these No plays that are kind of apertures for thinking about these other worlds and that are triggered through allusion or, kind of evocation in a prop. They can get piled onto this No stage, even though nothing is there. And it's like the apparitionality of any space on the No stage, then, being used as a way to bring together these spaces, it makes the capital and this kind of the apparitional nature of the capital a topic. And that's important because, of course, at the end of the Genpei War ends with, this non-return of one of the three imperial regalia, the establishment of Yoritomo's base in Kamakura, and kind of the bifurcation of the government to an extent, and and things are never quite the same, right? And then the No, Zeami was writing immediately after the Nanbokucho, so we have this other moment of kind of separation of the imperial regalia and part of the imperial family from the center. So, so there's this kind of the instability of the capital becomes something that gets thematized in these No in particular, I think. Probably not exclusively, but particularly in these, because it's easy, because it's, it's the Genpei War is that, right?
Thank you. Any other questions? If not, I would like to ask everyone to please join me once more in thanking Professor Oyler, and thank you all for coming out.
Thank you all very much for your patience.